Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Paradiso by Dante Alighieri. Now, The Paradiso is part 3 of Dante Alighieri's epic poem, The Divine Comedy, the first two parts of this poem being the Inferno and the Purgatory. Now, it is believed that Dante wrote the Divine Comedy somewhere between the years 1308 and 1320. Now, in the first part of this poem, the Inferno, Dante is guided through the 9 circles of hell by the spirit of the poet Virgil, and in the second part of the Divine Comedy, which is called the Purgatory, Dante is guided by Virgil through the realm of Purgatory, which of course is the space between heaven and hell. So now in the third part of the Divine Comedy, which of course is the Paradiso, Dante is guided through heaven by the spirit of Beatrice, who is a woman that Dante knew who actually died a few years before he wrote the Divine Comedy. So the basic plotline of the Paradiso is Beatrice is guiding Dante through the different levels of heaven, and in heaven Dante meets a lot of really big historical figures who are now in heaven, and he also meets friends of his and relatives of his who have died and gone to heaven. And in this story, Dante finds out that depending on how deep your servitude to God was in your lifetime, the closer to God you are in heaven. Now, Dante's idea of heaven was interesting because his idea of heaven is that the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars are all different levels of heaven, and he believed that the earth was the center of the universe, and the sun, the moon, the stars, and the planets all revolved around the earth. Now, you gotta understand that this was written back in the Middle Ages, and that's what people believed back then. Obviously now we realize that the sun is the center of our solar system, but back then they didn't know that, so Dante believed that the earth was the center of the universe and all the other spheres in space kind of just revolved around the earth. But what's interesting though is it does appear that Dante thought the earth was round, which of course it is, and I find that to be interesting because back then, I'm pretty sure a lot of people believed that the earth was flat, so it's interesting that he kind of knew that, yeah, the earth is round. Now, I thought The Paradiso was an absolutely beautiful poem. Now, I do think I like the Inferno a little bit better than this. I would say that the Inferno is probably my favorite part of the Divine Comedy. The Purgatory is probably my least favorite part, and I would say that this is probably my second favorite part of this poem. Now, the Paradiso, and I would say the Divine Comedy in general, is definitely a theological text. It's basically a poem written about Dante's love for God, but I also view this poem as very much being kind of a love story, because ultimately it's really a story about Dante finally being reunited with this woman Beatrice, whom Dante was in love with. Now, what's interesting about this woman Beatrice is, in reality, Dante hardly even knew Beatrice. Like, from everything I've heard, apparently Dante only actually met Beatrice, like, maybe 4 or 5 times in his entire life, so it's interesting that this woman that Dante hardly even knew became the subject of pretty much all his poems. Now, despite how beautiful the Divine Comedy actually is, by today's standards, we would probably say that Dante's love for Beatrice was a very superficial kind of love, because, as I said, he hardly even knew this woman. Now, another thing that's really interesting is Dante was actually married, but he never talks about his real wife at all in any of his poems. Now, the Divine Comedy was also very much a protest against a lot of the corruption that was going on politically at the time Dante wrote this, particularly in the church. Now, throughout this whole poem, Dante is constantly calling out Pope Boniface VIII, who was the Pope around this time, and Dante really hated this guy, and he's constantly, like, poking fun at him and calling him out throughout all three parts of the Divine Comedy. And Dante actually wrote the Divine Comedy when he was in exile from Florence, which was his home city. So the Divine Comedy is not just a love poem, and it's not just a theological story, but it's also very much a political story as well, and kind of a political protest against, as I said, the corruption that was going on at the time Dante wrote this. So, yeah, I highly recommend the Paradiso, but I also recommend reading the first two parts of this poem before you read this part. Now, if you're interested at all in the works of Dante, besides the Divine Comedy, I also recommend reading this book, La Via Nuova, which was actually Dante's first book. And this book is kind of a collection of love poems, but it's also kind of an autobiography by Dante as well. And if you're interested in the life of Dante, I recommend reading this book, Life of Dante by Giovanni Boccaccio, which was actually written only like a generation or so after Dante died. And Giovanni Boccaccio is actually a very famous writer as well. He also wrote the Decameron. So yeah, that's my review on the Paradiso by Dante Alighieri, and bye.